Okay, so we are on the final lecture, lecture 10 on chapter 15. This chapter is concerning dealing with, resisting, and the futures of globalization. So, as a brief introduction, it's important to know that this has been a theme throughout this course. That when we're talking about globalization, there's no single phenomenon to be dealt with, therefore, no single globalization to be resisted. Let's keep in mind that we're talking about a network of complex processes, some positive, some negative, that affect the world in uneven ways. So, dealing with the global economy, protectionism. So, this is actually a form of economic policy that's become popular in the last couple of years under the Trump administration. So, trade protectionism is a policy of systemic government intervention in foreign trade with the objective of encouraging more domestic production. So, part of Trump's America First paradigm is sort of encouraging the manufacturing of products at home and the reliance on domestic resources and production. So, this involves preferential treatment to domestic producers and discriminating against foreign competitors. So, you've heard about the trade war with China, I'm sure. So, one of the ways this is enacted is through tariffs and quotas on foreign imports. So, a quota would be limitations on the amount of imports from foreign countries, such as China. And a tariff isn't that, for example, China pays us or pays the US government any money. It's that people domestically pay the government a tariff or a tax on foreign imports. So if you are a producer in the United States and Trump is trying to discourage you from importing products from China and instead using domestic products, he's going to put a tariff on the Chinese imports or a tax on the Chinese imports that the American producer has to pay for using Chinese imports, and the money goes to the US government. So that's how tariffs works. It's not that China is paying the United States, it's that American producers and importers are paying the United States as a penalty for using foreign imports. Another way that this policy is enacted is through export subsidies and tax relief to producers. That to encourage production domestically and include it that you would give subsidies or just direct monetary compensation to producers for producing in the United States as they export to the rest of the world. And another form would be tax relief to producers, that sometimes, in addition to just receiving money from the US government to help the cost of domestic production, instead they'll be given tax relief, or they won't have to pay as high a taxes as producers in other fields, or producers that do that rely on natural resources and resources abroad. So trade protectionism declined before Trump because of a perception that was pretty widespread and well accepted that its negative effects outweighed the benefits. So those industries that receive protection become more inefficient and they become dependent on subsidies and tax relief. So that's one argument. The other argument is that it discourages exports as well as imports because tariffs on imported components raise the cost of production in industries of the nation engaging in protectionism. A lot of domestic producers relied on cheap imports of raw materials from other countries. And now that there's tariffs on those imports, the cost of production has gone up, and sometimes in a way that's not sustainable. So it sometimes drives industry to leave the country rather than benefiting from these policies. So most famously, Harley Davidson, because of the trade war going on with China, its raw materials were too expensive because of the tariffs, and Harley Davidson decided to move production out of the United States. So the opposite of protectionism would be trade liberalization. So not interfering with global trade and letting sort of the market determine prices and exchange without as much government interference. Dealing with the global economy continued, we need to discuss the concept of fair trade. So fair trade is a concept that's opposed to free trade. And free trade, remember, is at the heart of neoliberalism. So fair trade is a sort of a policy or a concept that's in conflict with outright neoliberalism. And fair trade is defined as a concern for the social, economic, and environmental well being of marginalized small producers. So, here are some of the elements of fair trade: direct relationships between producers in the South with consumers in the North, establishing more just prices, protecting producers, especially farmers, from dramatic swings in prices, providing work for the economically disadvantaged in the South, protecting workers' rights, including the right to unionize, protecting work that is safe and not exploitative of women and children, engaging in environmentally sound practices, and making sure what is produced is healthy to consume. So helping the bottom billion, or the billion people on the planet that are least well off socially and economically. So in this chapter, to address the bottom billion, it discussed aid. And it was interesting to note that the U.S. actually gives less in aid than most European countries. And it also highlighted some problems with aid. And these would include that the effects tend to diminish as aid increases, that the bureaucracies involved in distributing and organizing the distribution of aid do not function well and interfere with each other. That aid money tends to flow into dysfunctional areas such as the military, that it can stimulate civil wars by making the capture of the government more valuable. It has little effect on the natural resources trap that we discussed in a prior lecture. And also, when we were talking about sort of the traps of countries that are heavily populated by the bottom billion, one of the problems was they have a lack of transportation to the coasts. And aid, of course, does not address that vital issue. There's also a dependency on aid that hurts domestic production. So in Africa, the fact that a lot of African nations received used clothing from more developed nations like the United States has hurt the apparel industry in Africa. Dealing with political globalization, accountability, and transparency. So all political organizations, including nation states, need to be held more accountable for their actions. And it suggested that there needs to be enhanced surveillance over political organizations, including nation states. The book highlighted a lack of transparency in nuclear programs, which is especially disconcerting. And it made a distinction between transparency on the one hand and secrecy and opacity on the other. So by secrecy, we mean the deliberate withholding of information. So the information exists and it's being withheld. Opacity is an absence of information, that some harm of certain policies isn't even investigated. We don't even have the information. So that'd be a different issue. Transparency International is an international non-government organization founded in 1993 that is focused on battling corruption globally, and in the process of doing this developed a corruption index and bribe payers index that sort of looks into and rates the level of corruption of various nation states and political organizations globally. Dealing with global health issues. So this is the focus of the UN's World Health Organization. It has been criticized for poor leadership, being overly bureaucratized, corruption, and being poorly funded. There's also been a lack of investment in diseases that affect the South. The UN's World Health Organization is in tension and direct conflict with a growing foundation called the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation. And the problem with this is that as the Gates Foundation gains more power and influence, the issue is that it is less monitored than the World Health Organization. And then the book also raised the issue of healthcare in the US, which we discussed in the last lecture, and the question of, is healthcare a human right? Because right now the healthcare system in the United States is privatized and for profit, and not everyone is guaranteed health insurance and healthcare, and that tens of thousands of people die annually because of a lack of access to healthcare. Alter globalizations. So resistance, like globalization itself, must be seen as being highly complex, contradictory, and ambiguous. These alter globalization movements and ideas are ranging from radically progressive to some that are reactionary and conservative. And it's important to think of these movements as not anti-globalization, but alter globalization from below. So alter globalization from below is in contrast to globalization from above. Globalization from above would mean globalizing efforts of neoliberal economic systems, multinational corporations, aggressively expanding nation states, large and proselytizing. Proselytizing means like trying to convert people aggressively, religions of McWorld, etc. Usually globalization from below is associated with the left, but the book points out that there are less visible, more right-wing elements also involved in the movement. For example, isolationist movements, ultranationalists and neo-fascists, and religious fundamentalists. A social movement. So networks of groups and activists with an emerging identity involved in conflictual issues, using mainly unconventional forms of participation. So that is the definition of a social movement. Their definition of conflict is that it is global in scope and that they have developed their own global organizational structures. At the heart of these movements is protest, which is based on three logics. That protest has at least the potential to cause material damage, and this threat has symbolic value. That protest requires great numbers of people to participate, demonstrating the strength of and the danger posed by these movements to people in power. And it is the logic of witnessing that those involved in acts of civil disobedience are putting their bodies and even their lives on the line. Labor movements. So the modern labor movement is traceable to the 19th century and the development of industrialization. As sort of capitalism expanded and industrialization took place, the masses were working in industrialized jobs under poor working conditions. And to improve the working conditions of labor and of workers banded together into unions. And together in the organization of unions could collectively bargain with their bosses. And of course, the major way that they enacted their power was through striking, that they would collectively withhold their labor from factories and networks of factories and industries in order to get improved working conditions and compensation. If it weren't for the modern labor movement, there wouldn't have been the establishment of a standardized 8-hour workday, the weekend, child labor laws, basic safety regulations in the workplace. So before the modern labor movement, working conditions, particularly in industrialization, were very grisly. Unions tend to be associated with left-wing political parties, but not always. And some of them have led to the establishment of cooperatives. A co-op or cooperative is a store or factory or workplace that is owned by the employees and engages in what's called profit sharing. So instead of the profit going to bosses and people that own privately the factory or the store, the profit is equally distributed among the employees. The dominant view today is that labor unions in general are of declining importance. During the time that the United States had the largest and most prosperous middle class was in the 1950s. And that also coincided with the peak level of union power and participation. So many say that the stagnation of wages in the United States is because of the loss of power among unions. So, for example, in the 1950s, one man working as a janitor in an elementary school could afford to support a family of four and own a house and a car. That wages have, and the cost of living has skyrocketed and wages have stagnated. And now people often have to work 2 to 3 jobs just to support themselves, let alone their children and families. Also, the idea that labor unions are of declining importance is because of the rise of power in multinational corporations. The World Social Forum. So this is an organization that held its first meeting in 2001. It formed as a reaction against the World Economic Forum. A key focus is the lack of democracy in global economic and political affairs. Its slogan is "Another world is possible," and it formed on the basis of cyber activism, or organizing interested parties through connecting through the internet and raising awareness through the internet. So this is a social forum that really is combating sort of neoliberal ideas and policies globally. So the futures of globalization. So again, there's no single globalization, so there's no single future. So one question is, can every part of the world in the not too distant future achieve the standard of living, as well as similar cultural and political institutions of the most economically advanced and progressive nations in the world, like Denmark? Something also that needs to be pointed out that the book didn't discuss much is the future of automation and artificial intelligence and the future of work. So we are on the brink of an artificial intelligence and automation revolution that is going to impact the entire globe economically and socially. So many jobs are on the brink of being automated, or workers are being replaced by machines at an unprecedented level. This has been something that's been happening since the Industrial Revolution, but because of developments in AI, people are predicting that this is going to happen at a rate that is unprecedented, and there's going to be very few jobs left. So what is the future of work? How is the world going to geopolitically cope with this? Given again, today, there's more than enough food for everyone on the planet. Like, there's enough food, even with our really wasteful production of meat, that enough people could get, that every person on the planet can get like almost 3,000 calories a day. Yet there are people that are starving to death. There's like 800 million people that are malnourished. So the issue isn't that we don't have enough resources. The issue is that we don't have enough opportunities or jobs for people to prove that they deserve access to these resources. So how is that issue going to be compounded by automation and the artificial intelligence revolution? The book referred to a Mad Max scenario. So this refers to a series of movies that dealt with an apocalyptic vision of the future, with people thrown back into primitive and extremely violent ways of life. So some reasons for predicting that this might be our future are ever accelerating crises in the capitalist economy, dramatically rising oil prices, increasingly short supplies of oil, population growth in less developed areas, declining supplies of fresh water, rising seawater displacing large numbers of people from islands and coastal areas. So the sea level rising is because of global warming and the massive amounts of ice in the Arctic and in Antarctica that are falling into the water each year that are going to raise sea levels. And most coastal cities, it's predicted, if the global temperatures rise at least 2 degrees, will be subsumed underwater. And most people live in coastal areas. So imagine the geopolitical fallout of having to evacuate all the major population centers of the world. Nuclear exchanges that could lead to larger nuclear wars, nuclear weapons falling in the hands of terrorists, etc. So some questions. Explain the policy of trade protectionism, the intention behind it, and 3 reasons why economists typically argue that the costs outweigh the benefits. Describe 2 examples of altered globalization and why one might argue these resistance movements are better described as altered globalization movements rather than anti-globalization movements. And then for more provocative discussion questions would include, what is your ideal vision of the future of globalization? And perhaps in contrast to your ideal vision, perhaps not, what do you think is the most likely future of globalization?